Today's Frugal Friday video isn't a traditional pattern. Lauren Mormino did a video for this pouch on her channel several years ago. I feel like it is such a fun pattern. I love to make it, and I have made a couple of different tweaks to it just to make it easier for me in my sewing room. But since this is such an easy pouch to sew up, I thought it would be a great time to go over some tips and tricks for sewing with clear vinyl and jelly vinyl and just some best practices. The original version of Lauren's actually has clear vinyl on the top and the back, and she uses a cotton woven or a vinyl for the bottom pieces. I'm using jelly for mine. And the way I did it is the clear vinyl is only this top portion on the front, the bottom's the jelly, the back is entirely jelly, and inside you can see it's just unfinished. It is all raw edges, but they are a non-frame material, so it's not too big of a deal. The reason I started doing it this way is because I feel like you can see the clear vinyl so much better if you have the jelly on the back, especially if you use a white jelly, or if you are using a color that is light and doesn't distract too much from it. When I would sew these with clear vinyl on both sides, sometimes it would look, I would want to call it muddy, because you would see the wrong side of the back of the clear. So when you looked at it, you would see this part poking through on the back, and I just felt like it just didn't showcase the vinyl quite as well. So that is why I do it like this. Here is the original version that Lauren made in her video. I'm not going to give the measurements just for protection of what she has created, but basically any measurements will work. It's not a problem. So just to show that all measurements would work, on this one it's those original measurements, but on this one I took 2 inches off the height and 2 inches off the width, and this one turned out just adorable. On this one, I'm going to be in between these two sizes, so it'll be 1 inch off the height and 1 inch off the width. I've even made these to custom fit certain things. I was going to a family picnic once, and I knew I needed to take a bunch of serving spoons and utensils, so I made one really tall and skinny so I could put all those utensils in there. These take no time to whip up. They're super great to use for things like gifts. So you need to give a last minute gift to someone. Kids especially love them. You don't have to go out and buy a gift bag. You can just make one of these and fill it up with the gift. So now that we talked about the pattern, let's talk a little bit about the pieces. I have the one piece of the clear vinyl for the top. I have the one piece of jelly for the bottom. You can see I do have the corners cut out. I have the large piece that's going to be on the back. I did just rough cut this, so after I sew these two together, I will have to trim this piece up. I have one piece of number 5 zipper tape. I give myself about 1 inch on each end to make sure I have that kind of clearance there. I really want to make for sure that the zipper is not in the seam allowance at all. On one end, I turn the ends under 90 degrees. On the other end, I did grab a piece of jelly vinyl and just wrapped it around as a zipper end. But you could do this part on both edges if you want. So that's all the pieces we need to make this. The best way to cut this is to take your roll of clear vinyl, lay it down on your cutting mat, and use masking tape to hold it in place. It will tend to want to slip. It will tend to want to curl up. If you use masking tape along the edges, then you'll be able to focus with your ruler and rotary cutter to get a perfect cut instead of fighting with the clear vinyl or the jelly vinyl and worrying about it slipping. If you really don't feel comfortable with that, or if you have pattern pieces and you want to just cut them out, it is great to cut things out from this wrong side. So you would put your pattern piece here. I use a fine point Sharpie marker to trace on here. If you use a regular marking tool, it really doesn't show up as good. So if you use one of those fine tip Sharpie markers, you can trace the pattern pieces on this wrong side, and it makes it a lot easier. Once you have everything cut out for the pattern, then you got to worry about sewing it on your machine. Clear vinyl is notorious for giving people problems when sewing. My first machine I had would not sew clear vinyl. With this machine, I don't have any problems, but I do have to turn my tension up all the way. I leave that tension up, and I always get stitches that I feel really comfortable with. You can see here on the top stitching there and down here that the stitches look neat, clean. I'm not having those skip stitches. I also don't have a lot of foot pressure when I'm sewing because it will tend to grab. That foot will pull and grab on it, and creating that drag will cause problems with the stitches as well. That's why a lot of people use a Teflon foot when sewing with clear or jelly vinyl. I don't use a Teflon foot, but I have a very skinny foot. It's an 1/8 of an inch foot. That means that there's a very small amount of my foot to even potentially grab onto the jelly or clear vinyl. If you have a bigger foot, yeah, you probably want to switch to a Teflon foot or do the Scotch tape trick where you put Scotch tape on the bottom of it. Or what I would do for a lot of the ladies whenever I teach classes with clear vinyl, I would bring a roll of parchment paper and they could sew through it and then it would just perforate. I don't recommend the tissue paper because it is very hard to get the tissue out of the seams. You have to really use tweezers and get it out, whereas the parchment paper rips cleanly. So now that we've went over some tips, let's go ahead and start sewing this pouch up and you will see how quick it comes together. We have the bottom, we have the top. All we do is we have the jelly orientated with those cutouts at the bottom. We take the clear vinyl and we have it orientated the way we want it to go. This is how it'll look in the end. And then we just flip it down. As far as which you should sew up, if you should sew with the clear vinyl up or the jelly up, it doesn't matter so much. So if you have trouble sewing with the clear vinyl right sides up, flip this over and turn it so that the jelly is right sides up and see if that gives you a better stitch. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to sew across. I'll back stitch and go all the way down. I didn't clip these, so I'm just going to make for sure I take the time to go slow, keeping this raw edge lined up all the way using that seam allowance. The seam allowance really doesn't matter as long as you're consistent with the seam allowance you use. Now you can see while I'm sewing, I'm going very slow. I'm not speeding this up at all. I want to make for sure I don't have any problems with stitching. We don't want to go too fast and cause more of an issue with the dragging. You can see the stitches. It sewed perfectly on the front and the back, and that's what you want to see. If you're not getting these consistent stitches, work with that tension, work with the pressure on your foot. Play around even with your stitch length. I have mine set at almost a 4 because I know if I'd have it too small, I'd have more of a risk of having problems with it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up and I actually want to butterfly the seam. I don't need to, I just want it for decoration. So if you're struggling, say you're having those skip stitches, it's looking really bad, I would not top stitch then. I would just maybe use some double-sided tape or whatever to lay this seam flat and not worry about top stitching. But since my machine does do well on it, I'm just going to go ahead and top stitch both sides of the seam so my seam is butterflied. I'll occasionally put my hand underneath here to make sure that that seam is staying open. It'll have a tendency to want to curl back together. When I come to the edge, I'm not going to break my stitches. I'm simply going to go up to that next side and then turn around and then top stitch down this seam as well, making sure that I'm keeping that seam pushed up. I'm just going about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam that we just sewed. Now it's time to add the zipper. So I'm going to sew across the zipper tab first and then trim it up, and then I'll attach it to this front piece. I'm just going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from that raw edge. Once I have that sewn, I'm just going to trim up the overhang. So here is how that zipper looks. You have a choice here. You could easily just slip this clear vinyl on top and just top stitch there. If I was really in a hurry or if my machine was really struggling, I would do that. But I do prefer the look like this where I have it sewn the traditional way. So I sew the zipper right sides together with the bag front and back and then flip it and top stitch. So that's what I'm going to do for this one. You can mark your centers or you can just make sure that you have an even amount on both sides. You can see that my zipper is clearly not going to be in my seam allowance. Add a few clips here, and you're just going to sew with that full seam allowance all the way down. And I just do it on the zipper, of course. There's no need to go from edge to edge because there's nothing you'd be attaching it to. I have that zipper right sides down, and I'm just making sure that edge is staying in line with the clear vinyl while keeping my seam allowance consistent. Pulling the zipper pull up whenever I get to that point. Here is how this zipper looks. Now I do trim all threads at every step, because if you don't, they will be hiding in the seam and they'll just kind of be poking out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push that seam down. That'll flip that zipper up, and I'm going to top stitch. But I'm going to top stitch from edge to edge. I want to have this edge tacked down. So even though there's nothing there, I'm just going to sew the seam to itself. So I'll top stitch an 1/8 of an inch away all the way down. I'll go slow because as I'm going, you can see how that zipper is twisting. I will have to make for sure to push the seam down the entire way. You can see I did top stitch from edge to edge. Now we're going to attach that back piece to the top edge of this zipper. Since my jelly doesn't have a right or wrong way, it doesn't really matter, but what I do want to do is make for sure that I not only line up that top edge, but also the sides. So now that I have the zipper clipped with this jelly vinyl, I'm going to sew it from zipper edge to zipper edge with that full seam allowance. Another reason I go slow when sewing with clear and jelly vinyl is because every time my needle goes through the clear jelly vinyl, it does create a hole. So if I would have to pick it out, it would be tricky to get perfectly in that hole again. I have been known to even use a warm iron and piece of cloth to try to melt the holes if I made a mistake. It does happen, but I've learned to just slow down and go slow when sewing it so that I risk less in making mistakes. Now that that is sewn together, I'm going to once again top stitch by opening it up and having that seam going down just an 1/8 of an inch away, but this time I will do it from edge to edge. So now that we have the zipper sewn on, we're going to place these two pieces right sides together. I'll go ahead and open my zipper about halfway. And at this point, I'll see how much I need to trim off. So the first thing I do is I match up the sides, and I'm going to put one of my bigger clips right here on this zipper tab because it's kind of thick and stiff. Come over this other side, and I'm really worried more about matching up my zipper than I am this overhang. You can see I already have some overhang there present. I don't care. That's not going to bother me. I can trim that up. What I care about is having that zipper look nice in the end. So I'm going to lay it down, and I can see how much I'll need to trim, but I'll trim that afterwards. I'm going to sew first. I'll sew down both sides and across the bottom. Then I will trim up, box the corners, and we're done. So now that I have that sewn together, I'm going to start doing my trimming. I'm just trimming the overhang, none of the original jelly. And if you don't like having the overhang, you could definitely math it out. I think Lauren's pattern, I'm sure, has the correct measurements. I just never fool with it. I just kind of rough cut that back piece. I'm not trimming up any of the seam allowance yet. I will trim up a little bit after I sew it, but I want to leave it long because I want to box the corners and I want to be able to nest these seams. So I'm simply going to reach my hand in there and I'm going to open this bottom up. And I want to nest the seams. If there's one way that the bottom seam tends to want to go, I will let it go that way. But you can see I'm butting them right up against each other. They should fit evenly. The tip is with getting them to fit evenly is to sew the same seam allowance down the side as you do across the bottom. So if I would have sewn a 1/4 inch here and then 3/8 of an inch here, they would look like not even, and I would have to kind of adjust to get a perfect straight edge. But if you sew it the same seam allowance, it will work out. So now that I have the seam laying to the left on this side, I definitely want to make for sure it lays to the left on this one. Nesting them really nice there, going in, opening everything up so they lay flat on each other. And then what I do is I smash the bag down so that I can sew straight across. If you cut it evenly, if you sewed it with a good seam allowance, it should be a pretty even straight line here to sew down. This side was coming up, it wasn't looking even, so before I kind of adjusted to make it even, I stuck my hand in there to straighten everything out. As soon as I did that, as soon as I opened it, flattened it, smoothed it out, then it was back to that straight line again. Let's do the same sewing on the other side. And now the bag is complete. What I like to do is I like to trim up all my seams. But instead of just trimming them straight across, I like to angle in, kind of curve these bottom parts because they can be very sharp. I don't know if you can see this, but this is sharp. This is going to my great nephew who is almost 3. So I definitely want to try to round those curves so that when he's sticking his hand in there, even though it really wouldn't hurt him, it's just a little bit easier for him and there's no risk of any like scratches or anything like that. So I'll do that on both sides and on the box corners at the bottom. TPU is pretty easy to turn, but there is always the hair dryer trick where you blow the hot air in here. I'm just working with the TPU and you can see it folds really easy. You're going to take the time to poke out this corner. This will be the hardest spot to poke out, but it still comes out pretty easy. But just take your time, put your finger in there completely, and poke it through. You'll see that gap there, which is what you want. That is fine. Nothing's going to come out of that. So you can see if I push real hard, I can see the stitches. If that bothers you, you could always do a second row of stitches. But what I do is I just don't push out too far, and I kind of use my fingers to clamp it flat. And you can see it looks perfect. But the stitches do show if you push out too far, so I just don't push out too hard on this step. Let me switch angles so we can see this better. Look at how adorable this set turned out. My clear vinyl is from K&A Custom Fabrics. My jellies are from the Emporium. She had a pre-order for them a while back. I'm not for sure if she still has any or if she will be doing any more jelly pre-orders. But you can see that this pattern comes together so quick, so simple, so easy. I'm going to put the link for Lauren's original video in my description. In her description, you'll have the measurements. But as I said, you can change the measurements up to whatever you want. Plenty of options with this. You don't have to use jelly. You can use cotton woven. You could use vinyl. Anything you wanted to use. You can follow the pattern directions for how you would do that with the lining pieces. This is just the way I like to do it because all the edges are just a non-fraying material and it's so much easier. If you have any questions about this, definitely let me know. Thank you for watching another Frugal Friday video. I think I might do another Frugal Friday video next week with more clear vinyl. I have a little bit of this roll left, and I'll just, whenever I buy a roll of clear vinyl, I like to use all of it. I don't like to waste any of it. And since it's so easy to work with for quick makes, I think I'll do something else. So if you have a clear vinyl pattern that you know for free, let me know. Otherwise, I will just look for another one myself. And I hope today you have a wonderful day. Thanks so much for watching.